My name is John Bailey. I'm pleased to welcome you today. I'm the Executive Director of Digital Learning Now. We're an initiative, a campaign that was launched by former Governor Jeb Bush and former Governor Bob Wise about 2 years ago with the intention of helping states cultivate the policy environments necessary to support really next generation models of learning that are enabled by technology. Online learning, blended learning. There's a lot of outdated policy and regulations that get in the way of these new models. We heard a little bit about that actually in the last session with Common Core, about how is Common Core enabling new generations of blended learning. We're running into funding challenges, and so we're working with states primarily around sort of 4 different strategies. One, advocacy, helping states with passing legislation, passing laws, updating regulations, updating new policies in order to help cultivate, again, a more friendly digital learning environment. We're helping with capacity building. This is going to be particularly important with the panel and what we'll talk about today, but the implementation. Passing a law is just really sort of one part of really enacting a digital learning vision. The implementation we're finding is just a huge challenge, not just for state departments of education, but also for school districts that are sort of really wrestling with, what do we do with this newfound flexibility or this newfound opportunity that is enabled or given to us with new funding opportunities like Race to the Top District, or with new flexibilities around other different types of funds to sort of go through a transformation or conversion process. So capacity building is key. Thought leadership. We are working with Getting Smart with Tom Vander Ark on a whole series of white papers around implementation issues. So how do you do a one-to-one environment? How do you do blended learning? What is a blended learning models? What are the myths around online learning? But again, sort of very practical in implementation, as well as various types of events that we do here in DC, as well as in different states from a thought leadership standpoint. And then the 4th principle is something that's very sort of key and part of our DNA, and I think you could see that with Governor Bush this morning, but that's collaboration. So we try to work in conjunction with great partners out there, iNACOL, Susan Patrick, Michael Horn, and InnoSight, Doug Levin at CETA, CCSSO, NGA. We work pretty much with anyone that wants to be part of the digital learning conversation, and we want to work with them as part of their efforts, bring them into our efforts, and really make collaboration a key part of this. 2 quick housekeeping items. One, just want to let you know that this session is going to be recorded, so you'll be able to watch it online on the internet. It'll be streamed later on. And second, we have 1 mic, so this is going to be a very conversational panel. I'm going to just very quickly introduce our guests today, and then really turn it over to them with some key questions, and then we'll turn it over to you to ask your questions for the panelists as well. But when you have questions, I want you to use the mic in the center of the floor here. And just very quickly, reflecting over the last 2 days, it's been pretty remarkable how often digital learning has come up in conversations. And it's come up in sort of 3 different ways. One, in terms of empowering education reform. So this is really in the sense of enabling a lot of the different types of accountability that we're talking about, enabling the next generation teacher evaluation systems and supporting with professional development and personal learning communities. Talking about enabling new models of education and creating sort of a vibrancy in education that just is lacking, particularly in a lot of our high schools right now, but bringing in fresh digital content, fresh digital learning materials and resources and services that are sort of enabling entire new models of school. We're seeing that particularly around new models of online schools as well as blended charter schools, but increasingly, and we're going to hear from Dr. Edwards today, around how traditional school districts are transitioning and converting to new models. There were also, I think is so key, which has been a key theme and principle of this entire conference, which is how does digital learning help address equity? So this notion of the achievement gap, or what Secretary Duncan calls the opportunity gap, but the notion of we can now reach every single student where they are, with their strengths and weaknesses, and create a personalized learning plan for them. That was visionary just 5 years ago. It is now very much a reality today, thanks to the technology that we have available to us, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So the key thing, though, is that this transformation just doesn't happen by itself. Schools just don't sort of naturally evolve. Systems don't naturally evolve in this direction. It takes leadership. And that is why we are just so fortunate today to have key leaders that are leading this change from a state policy level, from the executive branch, the legislative branch, and then down at the school district level in terms of, again, introducing the new types of approaches and using this technology in transformative ways. And so what we're going to focus on is, again, a conversation around the opportunity, but very, very specific discussion, too, around how do you do this from an implementation standpoint. So increasingly, this is a question that we're getting, Michael Horn is getting, Susan Patrick, which is sort of we're bought into the vision, but how do we do this? Or how do we take advantage of this new type of law or flexibility? I think we saw this with the Race to the Top district competition, that we saw a lot of interest from schools, but when we were sort of doing some of the pre-reviews of the applications, it was remarkable in how folks had sort of a pretty flat vision in a way. It was sort of automating the existing way of doing education, not really transforming education. And so there's a vision approach to this, and then there's an implementation part with it. I will just very briefly introduce our panelists, but I'm going to ask you to refer to their bios in the brochure, not the brochure, but the program, and we'll just kick it off. But we are very fortunate to have with us Governor Perdue from North Carolina, who's been just a huge champion of education, but particularly around digital learning and doing some really transformative things there. We have Dr. Edwards, also from North Carolina, who many of you know from Henrico, Virginia, but is leading an amazing transformative effort in Mooresville School District for $7,500 per student. Has been able to introduce digital textbooks, one-to-one computing environment, and just really rich resources for both teachers as well as students. And I think has really sort of cracked a budget and funding code that we get a lot, and I know a lot of you are struggling with, which is how do we fund this transformation? Dr. Edwards has got both the vision as well as a lot of the practical. Representative Myhra from Minnesota, who again is pushing and advocating for how digital learning and online learning in particular can help bring resources to students and help address the equity question an issue. Senator Rogers from Georgia, which passed really one of the more cutting edge online and digital learning bills over the last 12 and 24 months. And so a lot to learn from and in terms of the implementation and also how other states can replicate that. And then State Chief of Oklahoma and Chiefs for Change, Janet Barresi, who again is leading that from an executive regulatory standpoint as well as working with her state legislature. I first want to turn to Governor Perdue to talk a little bit in terms of how you've approached digital learning, but in particular, one of the fundamental underlying technologies that enable digital learning, online assessment, is broadband. And broadband is very difficult, particularly the last mile in very rural areas where it's very expensive, but you've had a very unique and much heralded public-private partnership to help lower the costs and to help really bring that infrastructure out so that schools can participate in digital learning and as well as online assessments. And just, again, how you've approached digital learning as an issue and how you've exercised really great leadership. You have to know that Governor Perdue had a special session at NGA, and it was standing room only. I think we had 8 governors. You had 8 governors? With Joe Klein, myself, and Andy Rotherham, who you saw interview Secretary Duncan. And it was a rich conversation, but it was the most attended, I think, side session outside of the main sessions, and that's due to Governor Perdue's leadership. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm honored to be here with this esteemed panel and with John, who's playing such a leading role in helping folks around the country who are unlike us. We're all members of the choir, but there are millions of people in our country and in our states, thousands and thousands of people who still haven't figured out how transformative this whole concept of digital learning is and how we can work together through 3 principles. I believe that the thing that turned me on about digital learning and about technology in general was the opportunity for innovation. You can just do things differently and get away with it. With collaboration, you can't do this in a vacuum. If you're either a county, a city, or a system leader, you've got to have collaboration with the public and private sector. And finally, that you've got to be really flexible, just like we've all been all of our life. If you have a plan from A to Z, you can rest assured that about 12 of the letters in the alphabet are going to go awry, and you've got to restart. Back in 2005, I worked with a team of people led by Myhra Best, who's here with me, many of you know her, on something called the Business Education Technology Alliance. I was Lieutenant Governor. And I knew enough to be dangerous, but we brought business leaders from communications and from technology companies and from other pieces of the private sector together with policy leaders. And we began to chart out what it was our future in North Carolina could look like. And we quickly developed this model with great recommendations anchored by virtual public school, which many of the states are doing now. And we were so excited. We thought we had hung the moon and solved the problem, Mark Edwards, who has terrific success stories in Mooresville. But we got into it, and my state, like many of your states or areas, is very different. We're a huge state, 10 hours from one side to the other, almost 10 million people who live there. But we have huge pockets of poverty, huge areas of rural lack of access. And so we stood up our virtual. We had 3,000 kids enrolled pretty quickly. But we looked and realized the people we were trying to get, how to level that playing field regardless of zip code or economic capacity, we hadn't done that very well. And so we went back to our group and we said, what have we done wrong? And we started moving around the state. And I can tell you as a lieutenant governor, I would walk into schools where there were huge boxes of computers that had never been unboxed. There were teachers who were frustrated because every time they tried to go online with a course or with a question or even email, the systems would collapse and there was nobody there to help them. They hated technology, they hated me, and they hated infrastructure and the whole thing. They thought it was broken and that we were just messing it up and using hard-earned tax dollars to do stuff that was superfluous. Well, we went back, as John alluded to, and we figured out a way to build a statewide infrastructure system that would provide almost to the last mile coverage. And we put it together, and today we've got 70,000 users on our virtual system and are really robust across our state. So from my perspective, the state's role is one of thought leadership, obviously, and one of policy integration. You've got to have policies that work. But you've also got to be able to provide some hardcore infrastructure. And so how do you do that if you're going to have that free education and that level playing field that we all talk about in every speech we give? Well, first of all, we know that you can't change quickly enough to keep up with the rapid transformation of technology itself. So you've got to build out systems that are very adaptable. And you've got to figure out a way, and you'll hear more about that today, to keep channeling change into our state's budget policies and fundamental policies. But it's a fundamental thought leadership shift in how we prepare students for a global economy anchored by technology, I believe, that's going to get the job done. And you can do this very efficiently and very well if the state is willing, if your governor and your legislature and your local businesses are willing to leverage the private resources and any kind of public resources that you can put in play. North Carolina was lucky. I mean, we're luckier than a lot of you because we had been home to one of the first investments from the federal government back in the late 80s and 90s with a supercomputer. We had something called NC-RAN, and that was our fundamental backbone. And then we began to work with all of the private providers, from AT&T to Time Warner, you can name them, little companies and big companies, and we brought them to the table. We also brought the leaders of our K through 12 plus K through 20 public school system, community colleges and universities, both public and private. And we told them up front, we're going to create a big brand new sandbox, and we want you to play in it. But you're going to have to be nice and not punch each other while you're in the box. And we're all going to have to work together if we're going to succeed in North Carolina. We went to work very efficiently on maximizing every scintilla that we can get from federal E-rate. And we're all scared to death that that's going to be something that comes on the budget chop block during this discussion of federal deficit. We used our supercomputer called MCNZ to serve as the nonprofit funding agency to go out and procure both private dollars and federal dollars. We maximized the ORA money, the VTOP money, and we began to build out a system to hard-to-reach areas. That was my goal. My goal was to provide our state with a system that could reach every person in North Carolina, both rural and urban, and to build it out efficiently. I knew we didn't have the money to get to the last mile. So working with the corporate private providers, we convinced them if we could build them all the way through the middle mile with federal dollars and North Carolina dollars, then we could surely ask them to build the last miles. And they're doing it all over our state and doing it really, really well. We then took the rest of the top dollars that we got from our application that we won and built out cloud computing, have diagnostics throughout our system, and we know that we're on the right track. You can't do it, let me add, without public-private partnerships. You have to have that kind of cooperation, or else somebody will say you're trying to intervene and private enterprise. And that's worked really well with us in North Carolina, and I believe it will continue to work. You've got to have the flexibility. That's been our mantra all along. When you think you've got the paradigm fixed perfectly, something's going to change. And you've got to be willing to be adaptable and allow locals like Mark the flexibility to use the system and the network and to do what he needs to do to help his teachers really have great learning environments and help his kids succeed. And so you work from your strengths. And you've got to be really careful. This was something that I didn't think about initially in 2005. You've got to be careful that you follow the law and that you are corruption-free and that everything is 1,000,000% open and transparent, because somebody somehow is going to ask questions that you need to be able to answer with documented, established statements and proof. In case of our infrastructure, we have linked together both the private and public, and now every educational institution in our state is using our infrastructure, using our broadband. And as I end, I want to remind you again about the innovation, the collaboration, and the flexibility, and say that those three pieces work if you go into it with an open mind and you bring all of the naysayers as well as the yaysayers to the table as you begin to implement your strategy. And let me prove to you how successful we've been in 4 years. In the past 4 years, our K through 12 broadband usage has gone from 1 gig to 10 gigs. We're mighty proud of that. P20 has gone from 7 gigs to 35 gigs. And we've actually been able to do that because we've dropped the cost all over the state through the economies of scale. We've got a model that works. I believe that we have policies that work now for the most part in our state. We still have tremendous budget questions that we've got to resolve, and we've always got to be willing and ready to adopt a new model, because that will happen with technology. Thank you for allowing me to present the North Carolina story, John.
Excellent. I think we have some great follow-up questions, I think, on sort of the second wave, particularly around the flexibility. It's so key in terms of drafting policy and law. But this notion of, again, aggregate purchasing, sort of using that statewide purchasing power, it's the power behind the Smarter Balance in the Park Consortia, too, is that getting that economies of scale to help drive down the cost of assessments. But thinking about that in terms of laptops, like Maine and some of the other states, as well as with broadband, is so key, and I think we'll dive a little bit deeper into that. I now want to introduce Dr. Mark Edwards, who is with the Mooresville Graded School District, who has a book coming out about the history of the transformation there. But what is so important about the story that Mark is going to tell here is that many of us have heard about rocket ship learning. We've heard about Kip and Power that we featured here at the Digital Learning Expo. We've heard about Carpe Diem, great models, great charter school models. And I don't want to dismiss how difficult it is to start up their models or scale their models, but it's one thing to start a school from scratch. It's another to take a school that's been in a direction for decades and pivot it and transition it. And that's exactly what Mark has done, not with massive new amounts of government grants or funding, with a lot of support from his governor, but it's a powerful story. And so Mark, just welcome and invite you to tell it. I think we have a couple slides too with you. So.
Thanks, John. It's an honor to be with you today, and I certainly want to thank John and Governor Bush. I will mention that the book that John mentioned, the title of it's Every Child, Every Day, and Governor Bush and Governor Wise wrote the foreword. Senator Warner from Virginia wrote the back cover. I will share, Mooresville is a district of about 6,000 students, and we're about 20 minutes north of Charlotte, North Carolina. We're a district that used to be a mill town. It's a big NASCAR town, but our poverty rate has been growing. We're approaching 50% poverty. But 5 years ago, we implemented a program we call our digital conversion. We provided every student 3rd through 12th grade with a laptop computer. We moved away entirely from buying textbooks at that level, repurposed those funds to pay for the digital conversion, and we've seen some pretty dramatic impact. Now, we also focused a lot of attention on building capacity. Some of the main ingredients of this digital conversion, and I think this is really important as districts and states are looking at programs similar to this, and that is understanding that this transformative effort requires a change in the culture. a new thinking of methodology of how students work in classrooms. And we've had hundreds of visitors. We've actually had thousands of visitors. We had visitors Monday from California and Connecticut. And I will tell you, you don't arrive in Mooresville by accident. You have to want to get there. But I think that part of the rationale, people want to see this program because of the implication of the instructional impact. Using 21st century tools. When Governor Perdue was visiting in Mooresville, and I certainly want to salute our governor for her vision in terms of bringing broadband opportunities and an state infrastructure that enables districts to take this leap. But when she was visiting, she was talking to a class of fourth graders. And I remember she was asking them what they're doing. They said, we're vetting research. We're looking at this, and we're looking at triangulation of resources and how we're going to put it together. And they were working in a group, and there were some books over on the shelf. And she said, "Do you ever use those anymore?" And they said, "No, we don't use them anymore." One of the things that I have to say is the 21st century tools provide a data-rich environment. When our parents have access to daily grades, they can check a student's grades. Report cards are obsolete. They have information. Students have information. So there's this cognition factor with students, teachers, parents, and the community. So that 21st century tool set with the data-rich and intensive environment. One of the things that we focused on was building capacity of teachers, building the capacity of principals, and building the capacity of the community to understand that this new environment would change how we interact and how we work. And as Governor Perdue mentioned, the level of collaboration. It is absolutely common for our students to communicate with students all over the world. I was in a classroom a couple of weeks ago when students were connected with some students in China. It was another class and they were connected with some students in Chicago. So there's this interaction, we call it melting the walls, that has really changed the dynamic of our classrooms, what students are doing, how they feel about school. But the capacity building was essential. We just didn't turn the switch and everybody said, yay, this is a great thing. We had the typical, some of the resistance, individuals who had fear, but by building the capacity and focusing on that, we saw some great results. One of the things that I really believe has implications, and when we look at the Common Core and we look at transforming education and by taking full advantage of digital resources, is the level of precision. Our students and teachers have a new level of precision about information that really changes the dynamic of the whole learning equation. When visitors come, they say, we don't see a lot of whole group instruction. We're working in projects. Students are collaborating, they're studying together, they're working together. We also understand that competency is evolutional. Even 5 years ago, when we started this initiative, the competency levels of teachers and principals and support staff have changed dramatically. What we expect teachers to understand and know how to use a variety of resources, differentiate it. One of the things when Governor Perdue was visiting, she said the level of differentiation in the classrooms is stunning. There's individual group work, and we describe the teachers as roaming conductors. They're not standing up with one person talking, but they're moving around the room, intervening with the woodwinds here or the percussion here, but changing that dynamic in the classroom. One of the things that I love is the sense that the students have this innate sense that creativity and innovation drives what they're doing. There's a hum in the classroom. We've had lots of researchers in, and they come and say, you hear this noise, this hum, and I think that drives. And ultimately, the connectivity and the collaboration have created a sense of all in. There's great pride in the community. We're very proud of it. John, if we could go to that next slide, I want to share some of the return on this investment. By the way, we rank 100th in funding out of 115 districts in North Carolina. We are second in the state in terms of the academic composite. This is all testing 3rd through 12th grade. We're third in terms of our graduation rate in the state. We've had a 300% increase in scholarships for students, and we see that as a real return on investment to parents and to students. Our graduation rate for African American students is 95%, and it was 60% 5 years ago. Our graduation rate for all students was 64% 5 years ago, and our academic composite was 67%. And we're a community that I would call just kind of a Main Street America, but we've seen the dramatic impact. And I really believe that this is a model that's replicable. We've had Matt Aiken, who's an outstanding superintendent in Piedmont, Alabama, is here today, and we work together on the League of Innovative Schools, and Sarah Shapiro is here with the League of Innovative Schools. There are districts from all over the country that have visited that are replicating this model. We're learning from each other. So I believe the opportunity is great, there's excitement, and we can make great things happen. Thanks, John.
I think we'll come back to dig down a little bit deeper too in terms of again, you have to understand the 100 out of 115 districts in terms of funding, and it was a mindset. It was a rethinking of how do we repurpose funds and approach funds. And Mark's got some great stories that I think we'll dig into. I now want to introduce Pam Myhra, who's a Minnesota State Representative, who has been leading the charge in digital learning and online learning in Minnesota. And just want to ask you to talk a little bit about your efforts there, but also what sparked your passion in this issue? Because I understand there's sort of a personal story and an element to this that I'd love for you to sort of share.
Thank you so much, John, and good morning, everyone. I appreciate being able to share why I chief authored a bill on facilitating digital learning in my state. When I got home from the conference a year ago, the foundations from San Francisco, I told my husband and my children that I wanted to chief author this bill. And after they stopped laughing, because they know I'm really a digitally technology challenged individual, I frequently ask them to help me with the 3 remotes that we keep by the TV, and that's because I like their company, really, but don't tell them that. But I told them why. My first language was Spanish, and when my family moved to the United States when I was 6 years old, I really struggled with reading. First, second, and third grade were an utter nightmare. Going into 4th grade, there's a really important difference that happens. Before you go into 4th grade, you're supposed to be learning how to read. Once you're in 4th grade and beyond, you're supposed to be using reading to learn. But I was illiterate, and my 4th grade teacher dealt with that by instructing me to get answers from other kids, fold my hands, and be a good girl. And of course, by 5th grade, I hadn't learned another thing, and I entered with nil reading skills. But that year changed my life. I had Miss Keller. She saw me as an individual. She told me to work hard. She gave me hope, and she taught me to read. And in that year, I gained 5 years of reading growth. She had me on my own path at my own pace. When it was my decision to decide what was going on with my children's education, I decided to home educate them. I wanted them to learn how to read. I didn't want to take a chance that they might not have a good teacher and have the same kind of struggles that I experienced. Home educating them has so far been the most rewarding experience of my life. I taught them from preschool to high school graduation. Very early on, people would notice their academic achievement, and they would say things like, well, if I only had 3 kids in my class, all my students would be doing as well as yours. It's simply unfair. I can't afford private tutoring. My students all graduated. In fact, this last spring, my twins graduated from college, both of them with double majors, summa cum laude, magna cum laude. My youngest is graduating next spring, on track to graduate summa cum laude in accounting. It was a really positive experience. And by the way, homeschooling, we determined time, place, path, and pace. And I lamented in my first term in office this last session, how could those experiences that I went through be translated for benefit of the children in our state? Then last year I went to the convention out in San Francisco and was introduced to the concept of digital learning, where the child has an element of control over time, pace, path, and place. And the powerful concept of blended learning, where students all go at their own pace, and the teacher is a coach, a mentor, helping them, encouraging them. I have a list of resources. When I came back, I dove right into it. The most valuable resource in developing my bill was the report card that Digital Learning Now has online. And we had a conference call, and staff went through and explained the strengths and weaknesses of our statute that we already had. We have a very robust online statute in Minnesota already, and we were able to go ahead and do that. There were a lot of hurdles, but in the end, my bill passed unanimously and was signed by the governor. If you'd like me to go into any of those hurdles, I'd be happy to cover that in the question and answer time. In the end, the chair of Education Finance and Education Reform signed on to my bill, but also the Democrat minority leads signed on, and also the previous authors of those bills. I had been threatened that my bill would be torched when it got to the House floor, but instead we were able to turn that around, and they were my strongest advocates for the bill. This is no exaggeration. When I was in those early years of grade school, it was like I was locked in a dark closet, kicking with all my might. And no one heard me. No one came to my rescue. It seemed no one cared, until Miss Keller put me on my own path and pace. It changed my life forever. And that's what education does. This isn't just policy out there. This changes lives. Being on my own path and pace and learning to read turned me from desperation to opportunity, from turmoil to peace, and from heartache to joy. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think one big takeaway, I think you want to be the son or daughter of a Presbyterian minister or the son or daughter of Representative Myhra. So that's a big takeaway from the conference. Two other things. One, we talked a little bit about how technology not just changing new models of education, but enabling reform. You've heard a couple days over the last 2 days in Governor Bush talking about the importance of grade 3 reading. And in 32 states, 12 states in this last year have put in place very aggressive plans to make sure that students don't go past the 3rd grade without making sure that they're proficient in reading. The only way that policy can really sort of be enacted and accomplished at the district level, at the school level, is using technology. Some of the best blended learning tools out there are built around literacy, and so it's just a great opportunity there. Second, I love this notion of sort of, there's a myth out there that online learning and digital learning sort of robs teachers of what it is that they love about teaching, or that it depersonalizes and it's the exact opposite. When you step in one of these environments like Dr. Edwards was talking about and Representative Myhra, you see actually rich personalization, rich interaction. It actually makes teaching, the exact reason teachers got into the business of teaching is because it enriches that experience with the students in more one-on-one instruction. And lastly, the report card that was mentioned is something that we have up on our website, and it goes through 10 different elements of digital learning, 72 different sub-elements. We're in the process of updating that report card that will be released in the January-February timeframe. But again, it's a roadmap for you all states just to get a sense of how you're doing around broadband infrastructure, around policies that help and support competency-based learning like C-time, as well as online learning and blended learning. So go to Digital Learning Now to learn more about that. It's my pleasure now to introduce Georgia's Senate Majority Leader, Senator Rogers, who really passed one of the more cutting-edge online learning bills, digital learning bills over these last 2 years. And I just invite him to share a little bit about that. It's interesting too, because it's sort of, it was one of the first states to enact sort of a new wave of legislation that shifts the state role to being a broker of different courses. So approving sort of a portfolio of courses that districts, and many of courses that districts can select from to offer their students. And so Senator Rogers, just love to share your story and the bill and how you're seeing that play out in Georgia.
Be glad to. Thanks for having me. I want to, I guess these comments will be a little bit geared towards legislators or those who wish to influence them. But I kind of came into this, I've been a long advocate for school choice. I have this crazy idea that freedom's a good thing. And it dawned on me a few years ago that, it's kind of neat that children can choose schools, but what would be even better is if they could actually choose classes. And that's what digital learning actually puts on the table, is the opportunity to literally design the classes that you want in that format. And so the school almost becomes irrelevant to a certain degree. It's how do you want to design this around the individual child? So that's what got me into this. But with any issue dealing with education and lawmakers, in most of your states, I assume, are very similar to Georgia, education is your biggest bureaucracy. It's without question the most dollars that go to that. It's without question the most voters that are tied to that issue. So most lawmakers, not wanting to bang their head against a very hard wall, decide to go a different path and not necessarily take on the education bureaucracy. Some of us who are not real bright decide to try to do that. In that process, though, I think you have to recognize, how do you communicate with your federal legislators to get them to understand that what you're talking about is this an important issue? So I'll just share a few of my experiences with you, and I guess some of my better selling points. First of all, I think we, not just among lawmakers, but among Americans, have this silly belief that our children learn, that learning starts when they step off the bus to walk into the school, and it stops when they step back onto the bus to go home. The fact of the matter is that learning for our children is a 16-hour event every single day, assuming they're sleeping 8 hours a night. And if you look at it from that concept, that they are learning something while they're awake all day long, it's whether they're learning mathematics at school, or whether they're like my son learning how to master Minecraft on Xbox, they're learning something, right? So when you recognize that, then you have to ask yourselves, well, what are the things that they're interested in? How are they learning when they're not in a formal setting? Well, I can tell you, having 4 children of my own between the ages of 7 and 13, and if those who have children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews, they're all learning in a digital format, not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. So it seemed kind of silly to me that we have an education system that attempts to force them into learning a different way. I mean, imagine yourself as a 13-year-old who wake up in the morning and gets out your iPhone that your parents graciously bought for you and text 15, my 13-year-old never talks on the phone. She never talks on the phone. All she does is text message, right? So that's the way that she has chosen to communicate, and all her friends have chosen to communicate. And so she does that in the morning before she goes to school, on her way to school. And then imagine she gets into a classroom setting and the teacher says, all right, let's put up all of your digital devices, and I want you to sit still and listen to me for the next 50 minutes. And then in between classes, they go back to texting. And then as soon as they get home, they go and learn and do all the things either on their iPad or their laptop or whatever. We're forcing them into something that is fairly unnatural to them by having them sit there constantly for 50 minutes and try to learn. That's just not how, that's not us meeting them, that's forcing them to try to meet us. And then we wonder why 2/3 of kids in America drop out, because we're not meeting them where they are. And that's why this digital learning there's such an incredible opportunity here, because finally now we can meet them where they are. This is what they're already doing, and grab their attention, and plus have the incredible opportunity to offer them not just math, science, history, but this incredible landscape of learning opportunities that they've never seen before. Now, whenever I give a speech on this, and I give a lot, I typically ask this question, and about 10 to 25% of the people know what I'm talking about. I'm sure in here it's going to be 100%. How many people know what Khan Academy is? Now, when I asked that question 5 years ago, it was like, not here, but it's like 2 people would raise their hand. All right, so again, I go to my legislative friends and I often pose that question: how do you think your kids are learning, or grandchildren are learning when they're not in a classroom setting? And they all recognize us through a digital format. I'm on the education committee in the Senate, and this year when 60 Minutes did that incredible report on Khan Academy, a bunch of the guys on the education committee that I knew, I got a copy of that video and I just emailed it to them. I said, please watch this. And I had 2 or 3 of them come up to me the next day of session and say, that was really cool, I didn't know that existed. And I said, that's what I've been talking about. And so just little things like that, and being able to communicate to them what it is you're talking about, because I'm sure many of your colleagues are like mine, they're somewhat foreign to some of these things when we really get into digital learning. And it's not the way they learned, frankly, it's not the way I learned, but it is the way our children are learning, and we have to come to grips with that. I'll be real brief on kind of what we did in Georgia, and I know I'm going to miss some things here. The first thing we said was, look, starting with children that begin high school in 2014, 15, they need to graduate with taking at least 1 digital class. Now, I actually people came to me and said, I can't believe you're going to force them to have one digital class. And I'm saying, listen, for a child that's graduating by 2019, if they haven't had a digital class, they are so far behind, we ought to be ashamed of ourselves as lawmakers. So I don't even think that's really a legitimate hurdle, but you at least need to get the idea out there that this is something that they need to begin doing. Another challenge that you're going to have is that, and we wrestled with this when we changed the law, is that they must be made available to students. We've had the Georgia Virtual School. I'll talk about that in just a few seconds of online learning. But we had school systems that when a child would request to take a digital class, they'd say no. And the law changed that and said if a child requests to take one of these classes, it has to be made available to that child. In that context, you've got to make it cost effective for the local systems. We had a scheme in Georgia where if a child, for your FTE count, it was broken up on a course-by-course basis throughout the day, and the local school systems are funded by how many students are taking how many courses, funded essentially on an individual course basis. And they were losing an entire funding segment there if a student took an online class. So you can imagine it's not in their best interest to encourage children to take these classes. We had to change that. We said, no, you're not going to lose any funding at all. All you have to do is pay the state back or the provider back for how much the class actually cost, and we set a maximum of $250, I believe it was, which is far less than so now it's a profit center for them, which gets their interest. In that respect, even with that, you're going to have some in the system who will stop, they will try to prevent this at all cost. We have one school system that I've been made aware of since we passed this law that actually came up with the idea. They said, well, if a student wants to take one of these digital classes while they're here at school, they actually need to leave campus and go somewhere else and then come back and take the rest of their classes. And I'm like, what, are you crazy? So we had to fix that problem. Another one of the things that we did was, which wasn't in this bill, it was in another bill, established a clearinghouse in our state, which I think is a great idea and a very simple idea, of just saying the state needs to set up a clearinghouse where you can take the best ideas that are happening, and believe me, they're happening out there in your systems. The best ideas in digital learning, even if it's a videotaped class that somebody put on YouTube, and have that all come into one central place so that it can be shared with everybody else. That's very simple, very cost effective, and very beneficial to everyone. And then the final thing, and you referenced it, was you really, if you want to take this to where it can be and ought to be, this has got to be an open marketplace. Having the state simply design something is good. It's better than what you probably have now. But what we've done is say, allow the state to set the standards and allow the private sector to come in and meet those standards. And then students or systems can use any of those providers that have been approved that have met those standards. Now, how's it doing? Again, we've had the Georgia Virtual School for a few years. In Georgia, we have a requirement for what's known as end-of-course testing. It's a state test that is given to every kid in every subject, and we determine whether they pass or not. For the students that were taking the Georgia Virtual School classes, 88% passed, and the students who were not, who were just taking the traditional classes, 69% passed. So we see almost a 20% difference there, and it's more cost effective. And then there was a pilot program that was done in Bibb County, which if any of you are familiar with Georgia, Bibb County is in Macon, which has a fairly high poverty rate, and I believe about 2/3 of the students are minority students. And they did a one-year pilot program taking these kids and using the Georgia Virtual School. And they saw a 12% increase in 1 year in literature scores, a 1% increase in economics, a 20% increase in math scores, and a 6% increase in history scores. Now that was in 1 year, all those improvements. And again, it costs less money. So I think we're really onto something here. More freedom for everybody, more opportunity for our students, lower costs, and allowing them to have access to things that they could never dream of having access to. I mean, we think about education being the great equalizer, right? I mean, that is the great equalizer in American society, is to say that it doesn't matter where you come from, if you're educated in our country, you've got an opportunity. But the reality is that education in every one of our states is different from district to district. And some students in some districts just have built-in advantages that are simply unfair to those students who don't have them. And technology is that bridge that can bring all of that together and equalize all that. So if if education is a great equalizer in American society, technology is the great equalizer in education, and we have the opportunity to do that through digital learning.
Great. Two just things to build on was just discussed. One is it is so difficult to sort of communicate what these opportunities look like without experiencing them, right? It's difficult to sort of present them in a PowerPoint or in a brochure without sort of physically going to a school or seeing what one of these experiences looks like, and just really encourage you to take the opportunity. We could help match you and take you to Georgia, take you to North Carolina to visit Governor Perdue and Dr. Edwards, but also take the opportunity as well. This can be intimidating with all the techno-Latin, right? Like, gigabytes per second, and what's that number mean? And it very quickly can dissolve into a conversation with lots of technical talk, and you don't know like exactly what's happening. Use the providers and the other school models out there to help just educate you. Have them come in and do demos and go see what their schools are. It's the whole reason that there's the expo upstairs with sort of great providers there. We have Florida Virtual School. We have Robin and Senator Stevenson from Utah that just passed a pretty vanguard bill too. Use these folks to help share those experiences and help educate you. Just learn from it. And we can help facilitate travel to go visit some of these sites too. But it's so key to experience it. It's the power of that Sal Khan story that was recently on 60 Minutes, but also on the cover of Forbes. It just reaches a whole new audience and helps sort of makes this accessible. It's a huge advocacy tool that we sort of sometimes underestimate. I now want to introduce one of our great Chiefs for Change, State Chief of Oklahoma, Janet Barresi, who is really, again, leading the digital learning charge and helping to build and cultivate the support there. Just wanted to talk about how are you doing that with the legislature that, again, has sort of been resistant to change and embracing sort of these new models, and what are some of the lessons you've learned and the arrows in your back as you've fought this fight over the last couple of years?
Well, since many of those legislators are in this room, let me underscore the fact that
They've been great.
They have made some courageous votes during some very difficult times. It is true. Oklahoma has really, truly gone through a renaissance since I took office in January of 2011, and it has truly been an honor just to be a part of it and to be at the State Department of Education. But I will tell you, John, as you said, the actually being there and experiencing it is so very important. And about a year ago, I was in the Apple store trying to do something to my old and dilapidated laptop, and I was there working with a technician, and I noticed that a mother came into the Apple store, and trailing her were two little boys. One of them looked to be about maybe 4, and the other one was maybe 6. And I've raised 2 boys, so I know what happens if a mom is engaged in a store for over 5 minutes of what those little boys start doing. And there's usually a lot of talk of stop that and don't make me come back there and things such as that. And so as this mother was completely engaged with this technician, and I looked on my watch, folks, and it was 30 minutes. Those 2 little boys plopped themselves down at that table and picked up an iPad and started engaging with the apps and were completely engaged the entire time. I was sold. In Oklahoma, we have passed, our legislature has passed, and our governor has signed a suite of reforms that are absolutely transformational in the state. And those are all big policy issues. It's under an arching umbrella in the state that we have all devoted ourselves to, and that is by the year 2020, each student in Oklahoma graduating from our high school will be college, career, and citizen ready. And in order to do that, you have to pass big policies, and that's great. But the most important thing is to implement those policies. That's the work. That is the tough work that is going on. You have to implement them in the most rural, remote parts of the state of Oklahoma and in deep into our urban school districts where students challenged by poverty, urban poverty, and students challenged by rural poverty need to have an equal opportunity to have access to meaningful curricula and expanded opportunities. Because, as has been said so many times yesterday and today, that is the way out of poverty. That is the single most important way that we are going to lift children out of poverty, is through a quality education. So we passed a third grade social promotion bill. We passed teacher and leader effectiveness. We passed an A through F grade card. We have expanded choice in education, but those are big policies. And the use of digital learning, the use of technology in our state is definitely the framework that is surrounding those policies to assist with that implementation. And that is the work that we have been doing. And so while I don't think I would so much call it resistance, I think it would call it deep questioning and a lot of careful thought around that. But there is nothing like getting legislators into school districts that have begun to deeply implement this. And that's some of the work that we've done and that we're going to be very purposeful about. We have remote state board meetings on 3 different occasions. I even get my state board meeting members there, and they're going to be in one in January. And so when you have students that are excited, engaged, and you're watching first graders blog, when you have teachers telling you, this is why I got in teaching, this is how we are going to implement the Common Core and the work that we're doing, this is how I can follow data and to know how my students are doing. When you have a superintendent that says, yes, this can be done cost-wise, this can be done budget-wise, and then you develop your cadre of followers, and those become missionaries and continue to develop it. So it is absolutely important. When I came into office, quite frankly, in January of 2011, it was pretty much the Wild West in Oklahoma. There was very few guidelines, there was no focus, no program, and it was on the verge of complete collapse. And so we wish we were as far down the line as my colleagues here at the table, but we are absolutely dedicated in making sure that we have, first of all, the infrastructure in the state, and that we have the training for educators from superintendents down into the classroom to know how to use those devices, and that no one is frustrated and having access to those things by firewalls and being blocked about being able to get online. We are communicating that to our parents and letting them know how just because their kid doesn't come home with a backpack full of books doesn't mean that they don't have access to instructional materials and rich instructional materials. We are looking how to repurpose our dollars and to expand our state's interpretation of what textbook money is to assure that we're providing expanded opportunities for technology within their classrooms. And so all of those things are going about, but integral to implementing all of these reforms and everything we're doing is to create, and to echo my colleague's statement, is to create that culture where technology is underpinning all of this.
Excellent. Now is the opportunity where we get to invite you to be part of the conversation, ask some questions. I think in a nod to our friends from the UK that are here, if you can queue behind the center mic here. And maybe as folks are queuing up, just to ask a question to the panel generally. So, one of the questions that comes up frequently is just this issue of funding. How do you fund this change? How do you fund these new models? How do you create the economies of scale? And so maybe I'll just start with Governor Perdue. Maybe just talk about some of the strategies that you've seen effective in North Carolina, and then just anyone else in the panel, and then we'll turn over to the questions here. Governor Perdue.
Our economies of scale have been made possible by the fact that we've got the infrastructure, so everybody in the state has access to a fairly robust system. But examples like Dr. Edwards talked about, where he used an existing funding stream and decided that he was going to define it in his own terms, and then helped the legislature and others understand that technology in the 21st century is as much infrastructure, and the basic definition is water and sewer and natural gas and electricity. And so he used money that he had for one purpose, but renamed the purpose to be virtual. You just have to be really flexible and innovative. I mean, there are lots of dollars in all of our systems, and if the law allows you to move that money around and then show some kind of results, that's exactly the chance, the risk that all of us have to take.
John, I would just add that we spend approximately $50 per student for all of our content. And I spent a couple of years as a vice president for a large publishing house, and I remember one time we had developed a U.S. history textbook that cost $89. Now, it was a terrific book, lots of wonderful photos in it. And I thought, boy, this is a great book, but it was $89 for this bound material. And I was really proud. A couple of years ago, I walked in the classroom, I saw one of those books. And I said, look at that book. It was under a projector, and it was up on a screen, but I said, it's got some viable use. But when we think of $50 to provide students with the Library of Congress, a portal to the world, the efficiency in that, and then ultimately, I think the other efficiency is when you see a graduation rate improve by 30%, the cost implications of that alone for a state are phenomenal. And one of the things we've addressed in this efficiency model is hope and opportunity. Our students believe they can do anything they want to do because they are connected in ways and means that others are not. So there's great implications, the local level, the state, and the national level by presenting students with that opportunity. I would also call attention to Project Red, another outstanding report that details efficiencies that come about through moving into a digital platform as your primary means for education.
Great. Anyone else?
I would just say one thing you need to do is look through your laws and just apply some common sense. I'll tell you two quick things we did in Georgia that you almost shake your head as to why the law was the way it was. First, we talk about getting digital devices into the classroom and how much that's going to cost. I mean, kids already have these things. We had a law that prohibited children from bringing digital devices into the classroom, so we just said, okay, the way to solve that is to get rid of that prohibition. Since they already have these these items, and all you got to do is load the content on them, why not let them bring them to class? So we did that. And the second thing, which is a little curious, is that under our state law, and this of course was created with the idea of a textbook, is that the textbook remains the property of the system. Well, and that the child doesn't get to keep the textbook. I mean, you wouldn't give a child your $89 history book and say, you know, when you go to the next grade, just take that with you. So we had to change the law and say, no, if you're going to have a digital textbook and we're going to put it on your device, guess what? When you leave, you can actually keep it. Because that was one of the things that was hindering us, was that we were trying to take digital textbooks off of devices, which was crazy. I'll just use this example, and I think it's a pretty good example of what we're really talking about with digital learning. If this room was full of 7th graders, if everybody in here was in the 7th grade, and we said, go find out about XYZ, how many of them are going to pick up an Encyclopedia Britannica, and how many of them are going to go and look on Wikipedia? Well, I can assure you, they're all going to go to Wikipedia. They're not going to go pick up an old book, and that's really what we're talking about.
If you want to learn more about Project Red, but also what Senator Rogers was just talking about, it's called BYOD, Bring Your Own Device Policy. We did a paper with Tom Van Ark that's on Digital Learning Now about sort of device policy and how districts and states are sort of tackling that, from Maine to just a number of states, Pennsylvania, school districts like Mooresville, but it's sort of a good reference to sort of help point you in different ways. So for questions, maybe just introduce yourself, your organization, and just a really short question for our panel here.
Sure. Garrett Johnson from Menlo Park, California. Thank you for your remarks. 4 in 10, roughly 4 in 10 African-American homes don't have a computer, don't have the internet in the home. So as we move to more digital content, how do we work to ensure that inequalities are not exacerbated by the disparities in the most at-risk, most disadvantaged communities? And then also, in the 50s, General Motors employed 400,000 people. Today, Apple, which is the world's largest company, employs 40,000 people, a 10x decline. How do we ensure that our young people, as you said, Superintendent, in Apple stores are able to eventually work for Apple or start the next Apple? You know, all young people, including young people who look like me, in the most disadvantaged communities. Thank you.
Let me start with what we're doing and what I think states around the country are doing, what you hear at the Governors Association meetings, is that you're building out a process using private enterprise so that folks have discounted access to internet cards and internet in the homes. Our system allows it to go into the homes and small businesses, which is helping our economies of scale grow for everybody, not based on what you can pay for. We would create another literacy divide if you provided bring your own devices, and the kids who are from poor families can't have a device. So you've got to layer that on top of it, the way Mark has and the way other systems have done. And then you've got to work with the telecommunications industry to make sure that it's affordable and that there are scholarships for families that can't afford it. You know, I'm old enough to understand you can't recreate the box of General Motors and Apple. You've got to accept that with technology and globalization, the whole world has changed in terms of workforce preparation. The good thing about America is that we are home to innovation and everybody wants to be here. Our universities are fabulous. Our research institutions are fabulous. And as long as we keep that capacity in our country, we are going to be competitive. And it's incumbent upon us to make sure that our kids are globally competitive. That's why virtual and digital is so incredibly important.
I would share that I think that in response to the question, this is why this is so important. In Mooresville, we had a huge digital divide, we had an opportunity divide, we had a hope divide, and we had students haves and have-nots. A significant number of the have-nots were African-American students. And now the fact that the graduation rate for African-American students is 95%, when across the board we had 30 and 40-point gaps at third grade in Mooresville in math. Our lowest performing subgroup is at 92%. Every single group. In fact, when Secretary Duncan saw the data, he said that was not closing the divide, that was erasing the divide. But we also have a program that we've instituted for 5 years now, where we have students who take CTE courses. They're trained in computer repair. We have repair desk, help desk in every single school. The students man those desks. They learn how to repair the computers. In fact, they love, it's a NASCAR town, so they say, put me on the clock. They can repair a broken screen on a computer in less than 17 minutes, and they're very proud of it. And Apple hired one of our students immediately upon graduation because he was a phenomenal talent. But I think there's opportunities that are going to spring up, and I'll share this, that I think this is another question why this is so important. We were implementing a new software. And we had a group of teachers and a group of students. We said, test this, tell us how long you think it'll take for us to get comfortable. We had the students test it. They said, how long? We said, how long do you think it'll take? They said, it'll take forever. We said, how long? They said, well, today's Friday. By Monday, we'll be ready to go. Then we went to the group of teachers. We said, how long do you think it will take? They said, we think it'll take a long time, a couple semesters. Both groups were right. But the bottom line is, that the students must have this opportunity. If they're going to compete, let's make sure they have the tools to compete.
We have infrastructure challenges as well that we're beginning to resolve. Happily discovered that running along our state highways are thousands of miles of dark fiber that our state procured as partial payment from our vendors wanting to go across state lines. And so we are initiating the Oklahoma Pipeline Project out to districts to get that out there, and then looking to public-private partnerships to create that last mile linkage that is critical, because even our rural districts, some of our most rural districts, lack access and bandwidth to get there. And on a most practical level, we've got to get there in order to provide the assessments. Back in 14-15, all Oklahoma kids, though, starting in the 6th grade, are assessed online right now. So some of our school districts have to shut everything down in the school district in order to get maybe 20 kids on a computer to be able to take their test. That's where we are right now. It's a must-do type of infrastructure obligation, if you will, or objective in order to get them on. But I don't have a problem with taking the amount of students that have their own devices and can bring their own devices, and then allow, again, through public-private partnerships and possibly repurpose money coming from the state, providing those devices to the students that need them, that don't have them at home. And we're even discussing expanding the amount of cellular towers in the state to bring cellular services to those mobile devices that those kids can use so they have better access. But it is first and foremost, first of all, and you can have all these aspirations, but you've got to have the infrastructure there in order to meet them.
Excellent. Next question.
My name is Jamie Lunn from Washington State. Community colleges seem to be putting a great deal of emphasis on online content. Does anybody know of examples of high schools expanding their course offerings by simply providing community college content at a computer lab or otherwise?
Sure, there is opportunities for concurrent online enrollment by Oklahoma students with our colleges and universities, and that is being used right now. So, and that is actually being encouraged and used. So we have high schools that are promoting it within their own high school, that they develop the content themselves, and then also partnering with vendors, but then also are partnering with our community colleges and offering that as well.
In our state, we have, with a lot of support from Gates and other foundations, something we call the New Schools Project, where we have thousands of kids who sign up in 9th grade to complete 2 years of college the night they graduate from high school. And we're accomplishing that with a lot of blended learning, where students in high school are actually on the community college campus, or likewise they're in high school where the traditional school is, but they're taking virtual courses. It's been really successful in our state. There's nothing cooler than to go to a kid's classroom graduation from high school and see the same young girl or young boy walk across the stage and get an associate's degree either in science or the arts and sciences. It's cool. It's happening all over the country. But you got to, again, be flexible. You got to break down the rules. You got to break down the laws and commingle funds, and don't be inhibited by the fact that traditionally public schools have been paid based on seat time and based on FTE. You've got to do this paradigm differently.
It's also the power, I think, of these new models that we're seeing in Utah and in Georgia, also recently with the course choice program in Louisiana, where states are sort of approving providers that are coming from all different segments: community colleges, school districts themselves, private providers, nonprofit providers. But again, you're seeing different folks approaching different courses in different ways, and states sort of approving, creating sort of a rich menu that people can choose from. So I think that's there's sort of a wave of innovation that's happening there. Next question.
Thank you. My name is Yovel from No Child Held Back. I have a question about costs and budgets, mainly to Dr. Edwards or maybe Governor Perdue. So it seems like there's a lot more content, a lot more technology, a lot more devices. You need to staff to maintain and support that. You need to have a completely different infrastructure in the district, in the school, and in the state level. And I'm a technologist, not an educator. It's a well-known secret that from the total cost of ownership of a system, building it's about 10%, 15%. How are you provisioning, or how are you planning to kind of, when you roll it on a statewide or across it in a scalable model, how do you budget, or what's your plan for, the maintenance or overall support cost that all of this infrastructure will entail?
Sure, I'll be glad to answer and share our model, which we've shared with hundreds of districts. I believe there are currently districts in 40 states that are implementing the model after having visited Mooresville. And we look at it, we spend $7,400 per student per year. That's all funds, state, local, federal. We have not had any significant grants. And we break it down to a little over $1 a day. If you spend $1 a day per student, that provides the hardware, the maintenance, all content, and we look at the infrastructure. Unfortunately, again, with our governor's outstanding work, we have that infrastructure is embedded. We look at that as an embedded cost, like plumbing and parking lots, but that $1 a day. And when we think of, if you provide this student with the equivalent of $200 per year to this type of opportunity, that's prorated over a 4-year lease, but all of our students have Mac Airs. And we've been able to afford this, and again, we're one of the lowest funded districts in the state. And now, I will also say this, we have made some choices not to buy some things that we used to buy, because we no longer need them. So we've repurposed funding, but I really believe that it's doable, and when we look at the rich content that's available, online content, it makes all the sense in the world to invest this way, repurpose it, and provide every student with this opportunity for their future.
Next question.
A.D. Mudson from Agudath Israel of America. We represent Jewish non-public schools around the country. My question is the role of private schools with digital learning, both as content providers, such as in Georgia's Clearinghouse, as well as having equitable access, including perhaps funding with regards to access to public courses. What are your states doing? What are your thoughts on the role of private schools with digital learning?
Great question.
From our perspective, we're working very aggressively to allow just that to happen, whether it's private schools or homeschoolers or charter schools. You really have to open it up to everybody because the economy of your state and your country depends on the employability skills of everybody. And so we are in the process of having those political debates. They will be divisive, they will be angry, but at the end of the day, you can't afford not to get this stuff right. It's the future of our country and our workforce.
I'll tackle that because, and I don't want to go too much on my soapbox here, but when I talk about education, I think one of the biggest challenges we have is we adults often fight over the word that comes before education. They'll want to talk public education, virtual education, private education, homeschool education. We should replace all those with the word excellent. And if we can all agree on that, then we can stop most of these fights. And that, the question as it was posed, I remember having this, one of my more heated arguments with one of our former state school superintendents when we started the Georgia Virtual School. That particular superintendent wanted to put a law on that the public school children had first access, and then homeschool and private school could come after that if there were any leftovers. And that made me a little upset because I don't consider any of our children second class. But from a legal standpoint, my argument was, if this is a public school, which it is, you can't deny access to anyone. You can't say that a child who shows up for the first day of school at public school ABC, that if they came from a private school, they're not allowed in until all the second graders from the year before get their seats. I mean, that's ridiculous. So you have to have that mindset that this is open to everybody, that all of our children deserve this opportunity, as Governor Perdue said. And why would we ever have a policy we think is right and only apply it to a certain segment of our children? So this has got to be applied to everybody.
Great. Just one other thought on the funding streams. There's one funding stream that doesn't get often talked about, sort of the need for, potentially some modernization. Huge role in terms of helping to provide sort of accelerated access to broadband has been the E-rate program. And there's sort of been a quiet crisis brewing with the E-rate. This is the first year that the total amount of Tier 1 services, that's just plain internet and broadband services, was more than the entire cap for the whole fund. So more than $2.25 billion, which means that if they funded all the schools that came in on just the broadband, they wouldn't have any funds available for the Tier 2 and Tier 3 services. So there's a need there for potentially reform and helping to modernize, and that's a program that's benefited private schools as well as public schools. And it's also sort of key in terms of when it came out in 1996, it was really about providing broadband to schools, not providing broadband for learning. And so this whole school-to-home connection, that was sort of one of the first questions. I think there's a rich opportunity to sort of think about what would an E-rate look like today that could take that funds and help really support sort of broadband infrastructure in the 21st century here. So I just want to thank all of you. You've been a great audience, and please join me in thanking this great panel.